The Hindu Kush does not welcome strangers. It never has. The mountains that rise from the floor of Kandahar province in southern Afghanistan carry within their stone faces the memory of every army that has ever tried to move through them. Alexander the Great, the British Empire, the Soviet Union. The land itself seems designed for ambush. The valleys narrow without warning. The ridgelines are everywhere, and from the ridgelines, a man with a rifle and patience can make himself nearly invisible. This is the landscape that soldiers of the Canadian forces entered in the summer of 2005. And this is the landscape in which, in the burning heat of August, they would fight Canada's first significant ground engagement since the Korean War. August 3, 2005. Kandahar Province, Afghanistan. 0430 hours local time. Before dawn, the temperature in the Gumbad Valley was already climbing toward 40 degrees Celsius. The air smelled of dust and dry vegetation, of diesel fuel, and the particular mineral sharpness that comes off heated rock. A convoy of Canadian light armored vehicles moved north from Kandahar Airfield along Highway 4, their headlights off, navigating by the green-washed world of night vision optics. Inside the LAVs, the light armored vehicle 3s that formed the backbone of the Canadian battle group, soldiers sat with their knees pressed together and their rifles between their legs, trying not to think about the roads, about what might be buried beneath the gravel and the dirt. The Gumbad region sits roughly halfway between Kandahar city and the provincial capital of Tirin Kot in Uruzgan province, a corridor of strategic importance that both coalition forces and Taliban fighters understood perfectly well. The valley itself is a long, tapering throat of land, flanked by ridges of brown and grey stone. Pomegranate orchards cling to its lower slopes. Irrigation ditches thread between the compounds of mud brick homes that have stood in this valley for centuries. It is, by any measure, beautiful, in the way that genuinely dangerous places sometimes are. The Canadians had established a presence here, a small forward position they called the Gumbad Platoon House, as part of their broader effort to extend stability operations northward from Kandahar. The position was manned by a rotation of infantry soldiers from the 1st Battalion Princess Patricia's Canadian Light Infantry, the 1 PPCLI battle group, who had deployed to Kandahar province earlier that year as part of Canada's expanding commitment to the American-led coalition. Their task was simultaneously simple and impossibly complicated. Show up, be present, talk to elders, gather intelligence, and gradually convince a deeply skeptical population that the international forces in their country were something other than another wave of foreign soldiers come to take and leave. The Taliban had different ideas about the Gumbad Valley. By August 2005, the insurgency in southern Afghanistan had reached an inflection point. The 3 years following the initial American-led invasion of 2001, the Taliban had maintained a low profile, retreating into Pakistan, regrouping, rebuilding their networks, and waiting with a patience that their opponents frequently underestimated. Now they were coming back. Not in ones and twos, not in the isolated hit-and-run attacks that had characterized the early years of the insurgency, but in organized fighting groups of 30, 40, sometimes more. They were armed with AK-47 assault rifles, rocket-propelled grenades, machine guns, and a working knowledge of the terrain that coalition intelligence officers were still scrambling to acquire. They had commanders, they had communications, they had safe houses and weapons caches, and a network of civilian informants who could tell them where the Canadian vehicles were moving and when. On the morning of August 3rd, they were watching. They had been watching for days. The patrol that moved out of the Gumbad platoon house that morning was tasked with a security sweep of the valley, a standard operation designed to maintain a Canadian presence in the villages, collect information from local sources, and demonstrate to the population that this part of Afghanistan was not, as the Taliban were telling people, simply going to be abandoned by the coalition when it became inconvenient. The soldiers who climbed out of their vehicles and moved on foot through the compounds and along the irrigation ditches were experienced infantrymen. They had trained for this. They had prepared for this. But preparation and reality in Afghanistan frequently diverge at the most critical moment. And on the morning of August 3rd, reality arrived with extraordinary violence. The first shots came from the North Ridge, 07:12 hours. The ambush was well executed by any military standard. Taliban fighters had positioned themselves along multiple points of high ground that commanded the valley floor, creating interlocking fields of fire. When the first RPG round detonated, it announced to every fighter in the network that the moment had come. Within seconds, small arms fire was coming from 3 directions simultaneously. The Canadians were in a killing ground, exactly where an experienced ambush commander wants his enemy. What happened next would be talked about for years in the Princess Patricia's mess halls, and in briefing rooms at National Defence Headquarters in Ottawa, and in the quiet kitchens of homes across Western Canada, where wives and mothers and fathers were waiting for their soldiers to come home. What happened next was, depending on your perspective, either a near catastrophe or a demonstration of everything that professional soldiering is supposed to produce under extreme pressure. The section commander, a sergeant whose name would later be recommended for commendation, made the decision that all infantry doctrine demands in an ambush. Assault through. Do not go to ground. Do not try to retreat under fire. Close the distance with the enemy as fast as possible, because an attacker who is moving and closing is harder to hit, harder to fix, and far more psychologically destabilizing to the men on the other end of the weapon systems. The Canadians moved. They moved under fire. They moved toward the ridgeline. The LAV-3s provided critical support. The vehicles, each mounting a 25mm Bushmaster chain gun, capable of cycling through rounds at a rate that can shred adobe walls, tree lines and fighting positions with equal efficiency, oriented toward the high ground and began engaging. The turret operators worked methodically, tracking muzzle flashes and the telltale puffs of smoke that trail an RPG round as it leaves the launcher. The gun spoke in short, precise bursts. On the ridge, Taliban fighters who had positioned themselves expecting to direct fire down into a confused and stationary enemy found instead that the enemy was moving, was returning fire with weapons of a class entirely different from what they had anticipated, and was not, by any measure, breaking. The firefight lasted several hours. In the dust and heat of the Gumbad Valley, in the smoke of RPG detonations and the crack of AK rounds snapping past at supersonic speed, Canadian soldiers demonstrated the qualities that their army had spent decades trying to instill. Fire discipline, communication, the ability to think and move simultaneously under conditions that strip everything except training and instinct from a human being. Forward observers called for artillery support. Mortar teams set up and began putting rounds onto the ridgeline. An urgent request went up the chain of command for air support, and eventually American aircraft arrived overhead, circling at altitude, ready to deliver ordnance.